Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Today is the 11th of March, 2025, and today's class is on the Lawrence Mill Strike of 1912, also known as the Bread and Roses Strike. As always, the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies is a Party of Communist USA sponsored school. This is not a party school, so this does allow us to have a wide variety of topics and discussion on a variety of subjects. And with that, we will dive into the presentation for today. So we have a few sections. First, we have a intro into the organizers of the strike itself. We'll then be looking at the condition of the early textile industry in America, and it's not that great, trust me. Then they'll go over the strike itself, and then we'll have the aftermath plus a reading of the proclamation of the striking workers of Lawrence. And with that, we will begin with the organizers themselves, their bios. And for this, comrade, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Meet the organizers. Joseph Smiling Joe Ettore, 1885 to 1948. Son of an Italian immigrant, organizer for International Workers of the World, IWW, aka the Wobblies. Involved in other strikes such as the 1907 Portland Lumber Strike, Pressed Steel Car Strike in McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania in 1909, as well as others. Arturo Giovannitti, 1888 to 1959. He was immigrated to the Canada from Ripabatoni, Italy in 1900, was a labor organizer for IWW, a socialist, and a poet. Jailed along with Joseph Ettore for a frame-up at the Bread and Roses strike. Co-authored Arrows in the Gale, a collection of poems with Helen Keller on labor struggles and fight for civil liberties. Elizabeth Rebel Girl Gurley Flynn, 1890 to 1964. Labor organizer for the IWW, activist for women's suffrage and birth control, one of the founders of the American Civil Liberties Union. She joined the Communist Party in 1936 and served as national chair, first woman national chair, from 1961 until her death in 1964. We'll speak more on her on the March 25th PSMLS class titled Rebel Girl. Big Bill Haywood, 1869 to 1918. An executive member of the Socialist Party USA, one of the founders and leaders of the International Workers of the World, IWW. He was involved in many labor struggles and strikes, including, aside from the Lawrence Textile Strike, such as the 1903, 1904 miners' strike in Colorado called the Colorado Labor Wars. He was involved in the opposition to the U.S. entrance to World War I, which led to his imprisonment. He fled to the Soviet Union in 1921 when he was temporarily released from prison during an appeal trial. He lived his remaining life in the Soviet Union, where he died, and was one of the 4 Americans buried in the Kremlin necropolis.
Thank you, comrade. And we'll break for a very quick discussion round. I just noticed one correction. Big Bill Haywood died in 1928. It had said 1918 on the slide, and then that became nonsensical, especially after he had fled to the Soviet Union.
Right.
So, just a small correction there. If you have a question or comment, please use the raise hand function, and we will get to you in the order they go up.
Yeah, small question. What was the difference, or what was the need of the Socialist Party if the Communist Party existed? Thank you.
So during the Lawrence Mill Strike, this was 1912. The Communist Party did not exist yet. It did not come into being until at least in 1918, 1920s. So this is before the Communist Party happened. And did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say the Communist Party actually grew out of the Socialist Party USA. I mean, the Socialist Party remained, but a lot of the members that, went along with Lenin in resisting the imperialist war, World War I, were ousted from the Socialist Party, from the bureaucrats above. They There were two groups. There were the immigrants, which I forget what they were called, and then the Communist Labor Party of America. They eventually formed the CPUSA. Um, so so this was before the CPUSA, but it was kind of like the embryonic stage. It's kind of like with all the parties in Europe and the world, you had all the second international parties that fought, that pushed for fighting in the war on their country's behalf, and the Communist parties forming out of the resistance to that.
Thank you, comrade. Any other questions or comments? If not, then we will continue our presentation. So our second section is on the conditions of the early textile industry in America itself, and there will be a focus on Lawrence, Massachusetts. Go ahead, comrade.
Background, the first textile mill. The first textile mill was erected in 1793 by Samuel Slater. His factory would be memorialized for its contributions to American industry. Capitalists of the Northeast would start by forming partnerships that would evolve into corporations. This method made it easier to raise new funds without entering into complex partnerships that give away control of the company and reduces the liabilities of the enterprise for tax purposes. Background, the workers of the Lawrence Mill. Situated in the Merrimack River Valley, about 30 miles north of Boston, Lawrence had the reputation in 1912 of being the worsted center of the world. All told, the 12 mills in Lawrence, when operating at maximum capacity, furnished employment to approximately 32,000 men, women, and children. The working population in Lawrence's textile mills changed sharply in the nearly 7 decades between the founding of the city in 1845 and the Great Strike of 1912. Until the 1880s, the Native Americans, English, Irish, Scotch, and French Canadians were the majority in the textile factories. By the 1880s, these mostly skilled personnel were rapidly displaced, and after 1890, the Italians, Greeks, Portuguese, Russians, Poles, Lithuanians, Syrians, and Armenians took their places. By 1912, the Italians, Poles, Russians, Syrians, and Lithuanians had replaced the Native Americans and Western Europeans as the predominant groups in the textile mills of Lawrence. Within a 1-mile radius of the mill district, there lived 25 different nationalities, speaking a half 100 different languages. The largest ethnic group in the city was Italian. Lead up to the strike, speed-ups, and bonus. Chief among the grievances of the Lawrence workers was the bonus system which was used in the mills. Essentially a speed-up plan, it provided in the case of the better-paid occupations for a bonus to the worker whose output exceeded some fixed standard. In the other occupations, the bonus was paid for regular attendance. Any employee who had not missed more than 1 day during a 4-week period received a premium. The premium system encouraged weavers and other craftsmen to drive themselves mercilessly for the few extra dollars which meant so much to the family. Lead up to the strike, wage discrepancies. 2 sets of wages were paid, one for producing the finest cloth and the other for lesser grades. A striker testifying before Congress pointed out that with the machines constantly being speeded up, the cloth was frequently damaged and consequently graded as inferior, resulting in a reduction of their wages. Other complaints were voiced by workers in these congressional hearings. Water supplied by the mills was so warm in the weaving rooms that workers were forced to buy cold drinking water at a weekly charge of 10 cents. Workers, especially children, were docked an hour's pay for coming 5 or 10 minutes late, and repeated 3 times they were fired. All witnesses expressed severe indignation at the tyrannical attitude of foremen in their dealings with workers. The overseers insisted that the women workers sleep with them as a condition of holding on to their jobs, swore at the men, women, and children alike, constantly cursed at the foreign-born workers, calling them ignorant, dagos, and hunkies, and treating them as if they were dumb cattle. Workers' living condition. Nearly all the textile workers lived in a slum so congested that 2 tenements were erected on the same lot, one in front, the other on the rear of the lot. The rooms in these wooden fire traps were gloomy and dingy. Toilet facilities were inadequate and plumbing defective. 1 or 2 toilets for a 4-story tenement was not unusual. In his report for the year 1912, the Lawrence Inspector of Buildings wrote, "Conditions in the congested districts of the city are drawing close to the danger line in the manner of building construction for tenement purposes. The tendency of property owners to use every inch of available space has in some quarters developed conditions that are not alone a menace to health, but to life itself. Each year, he complained, I have recommended that the city council take up the matter of revising the building ordinances, but each year the proposal was buried by a council dominated by property owners, convinced these conditions were good enough for hunkies, poles, and wops. Lawrence had two dubious honors. One was that it was a leading contender for being the most congested city in the nation, with 33,700 people, 1/3 of the population dwelling on less than 1/13 of the city's area, the slum area. The other was that the infant mortality death rate in Lawrence was one of the highest in the industrial cities of the nation. Of the 1,524 deaths in Lawrence in 1910, 46.6% were of children less than 6 years. These were the conditions which led to the great upheaval of the Lawrence textile workers, although conditions were no better in other New England textile centers. In explaining why they finally revolted, the strikers stated, "For years, the employers have forced conditions upon us that gradually and surely broke up our homes. They have taken away our wives from our homes. Our children have been driven from the playground, stolen out of schools, and driven into the mills, where they were strapped to the machines, not only to force the fathers to compete, but that their young lives may be coined into dollars for a parasite class, that their very nerves, their laughter and joy denied, may be woven into cloth. We hold that as useful members of society and as producers, we have the right to lead decent and honorable lives, that we are to have homes and not shacks, and that we ought to have clean food and not adulterated food at high prices, that we ought to have clothes suited to the weather."
Thank you, comrade. With that, we will break for our second discussion round. If you have a question or a comment, please use the raise hand function, and we will get to you in the order that they went up.
Yeah, in that last slide, it said that the conditions there were no worse than other conditions elsewhere. And I was wondering what was the, I guess, striking point that occurred in Lawrence, and did that strike have any effect on the other living conditions of the other towns that were just as bad?
So yes, there was a bit of a trickle out from the strike in Lawrence, as we'll see in the next section. Generally, though, throughout New England, during the later 19th and early 20th century, it was one of the world's largest producers of industrial textiles. And the conditions that were described in Lawrence were pretty much synonymous with the rest of the area, in that there were these large factories that had people working long hours for low pay, while the bosses of them were raking in enormous profits. And a lot of the cotton or other fiber for these mills were coming from either the South or, in some cases, other places like Egypt or other places that were colonies of large imperial powers like the British Empire. So, but yes, we'll get to that in the next section.
Yeah, I was just curious to see, from how terrible the living conditions were in Lawrence, Massachusetts, like what's it like today? And apparently in the modern day, it's still pretty rough living out there. There's the poverty rate is like 19.4%, which is higher than the national average. And there's a lot of health issues that people have out there, as well as high crime rates. And it's still one of a really diverse community. Just wanted to share that.
Thank you, comrade. I can say I have parents who live in Lewiston, Maine, which is a former textile town. And there is, as they describe it, it's not as diverse as Lawrence, but there's still that lack of the opportunity. And ever since the mills shut down there, there's a slightly higher crime area there as compared to a more diversified and area of more opportunity, like one of the larger cities, or even like Portland, Maine. Though I guess nowadays in Portland, no one can really they're getting priced out of that as it gets gentrified. So, but that's another issue. Any other questions or comments for this section?
Yeah, it's probably obvious, but I'm shocked by these expectations they had back then, especially with children. I know personally, if I had that three-strike rule, or they took. I even had a job where I drove for an insurance company because the agents weren't allowed to drive with the papers themselves, and I was told to hurry up, and I actually got into a car accident. Somebody T-boned me through a stop sign. I can't imagine these horrid conditions and expectations that they were working under. I'm glad things have slightly improved. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. Though, just remember, though, recently in some meatpacking plants, they've had labor violations with children working there again, and unfortunately, the Gilded Age might be coming back in the worst ways.
Oh yeah, I was kind of wondering if you guys knew roughly the percentages, how many were children, how many were women, and how many were men.
Um, we got most of that section from the Philip Foner book of from the History of the Labor Movement in the United States. And Comrade, did you guys want to respond to that?
Sorry, I just have my own question. I do not know the
Oh,
answer.
okay. So I do not have the exact number on it, but generally the men were paid one wage, the women were paid something less than that, and the children were paid even less than that. And because all the workers lived in tenement slums that were also owned by these factories, there was rent, and they were also nickeled and dimed on everything from food, water, and very inadequate clothing. So there was the incentive to have their children work, and because the children are very tiny and can slip through all those little parts in the machines, they were viewed as necessary, even when some would start losing limbs and fingers. But no, I do not have that exact on hand.
So I just wanted to point out basically kind of what you said, that like children used to work there and there were no safety measures really for them, and they would make them crawl in these tight spaces. And in a specific instance in Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's book, Rebel Girl, she was at school. They said the kids at school could hear from the mill across the street. This happened to a girl that she got her hair caught in a loom and it basically scalped her. So it happened apparently a lot throughout that particular industry, and I'm sure others as well.
Yeah, I was curious about the statistic of the kids working in the mills. I couldn't find an exact number, but apparently a significant portion of the workers were children, and over half the workers were women and girls between the ages of 14 and 18.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that last part that was added, that essentially, they lived in a company town with the child labor, and I just want to stress the warning that there's many in the U.S. that's trying to bring this all this back today. We've seen a rise in laws in many, let's going to be honest, which Republican-led states uh, uh, bring rolling back child labor laws and allowing children to work in a lot of these horrendous conditions again. And on top of that, I don't know if anybody remembers, but a few years ago, in a lot of these, capitalist publications, there were articles essentially calling to bring back company towns. That's companies like Amazon for people to live in housing owned by the company and all this. And of course, there was that movie a few years ago, Sorry to Bother You, by Boots Riley, which is essentially a parody of this. So we need to be careful, because if we're not, they will try to bring all of these conditions back, and we're creeping that way now.
And I think this was in the first section, but it's just the parallels of today where they talked about the speed ups. And we see that today. The common example I'm familiar with is precision schedule railroading, how that is, quote unquote, making railroads more efficient. But as we see more East Palestines happening and railroad disasters happening. So, just showing that parallel. That's all.
I would also say it's same with these large warehouses, that more and more they want workers speeding up. Their pay doesn't increase, and there's been more fires and accidents that have been happening in these large warehouses. One of the, in fact, one of the new, what was it? The guy that's being proposed as head of OSHA now, he's got a past track record with both UPS and Amazon and all of the OSHA violations that happened under him and fires were horrendous, to say the least. All right. If there are no other questions or comments, we will go on to the next section, which is the strike itself. And most of this section will be from Big Bill Haywood's book, The Autobiography of William D. Haywood, which you can find online at the link on leninist.org.
From the Autobiography of Big Bill Haywood. It was a strike against all the mills, and every worker, except a few of the most skilled, took part in the struggle. The strikers demanded a 54-hour week, a 15% increase in pay, double pay for overtime, abolition of all bonus or premium systems, and no discrimination against workers for activities during the strike. The Lawrence strike grew until by the latter part of January 1912, there were 25,000 workers taking part in it. They were about 28 different nationalities and spoke 45 different dialects. The entire textile industry of Lawrence and vicinity was closed down tight. And there's a picture of the strikers, and you can see there's some children in that crowd. They spoke many times to the strikers and left Lawrence to go out and raise funds and create sympathy for the strike until on February 2nd, Ettore and Giovannitti were arrested under a framed-up charge of murder. Anna Lapisa, an Italian girl striker, had been killed by a policeman, but the charge was laid against the leaders of the strike. I returned at once to Lawrence and became chairman of the strike committee, which was composed of 56 members. Back of these were another 56 members ready to take the place of the strike committee if any arrests were made. A writer in The Outlook, a conservative weekly, which reported the strike, said, Haywood does not want unions of weavers, unions of spinners, unions of loom fixers, unions of wool sorters, but he wants one comprehensive union of all textile workers, which in time will take over the textile factories, as the steel workers will take over the steel mills and the railway workers the railways. Haywood interprets the class conflict literally as a war, which is always on, which becomes daily more bitter and uncompromising, which can end only with the conquest of capitalistic society by proletarians or wage workers, organized industry by industry. Haywood places no trust in trade agreements, which, according to his theory, lead merely to social peace and, quote, put the workers to sleep. Let the employer lock out his men when he pleases, and let the workmen strike when they please. He is opposed to arbitration, conciliation, compromise, to sliding scales, profit sharing, welfare work, to everything, in short, which may weaken the revolutionary force of the workers. He does not ask for the closed shop or the official recognition of the union. He has no intention of recognizing the employer. What he desires is not a treaty of industrial peace between the two high contracting parties, but merely the creation of a proletarian impulse, which will eventually revolutionize society. Haywood is a man who believes in men, not as you and I believe in them, but fervently, uncompromisingly, with an obstinate faith in the universal goodwill and constancy of the workers, worthy of a great religious leader. That is what makes him supremely dangerous. After the arrest of Ettore and Giovannitti, a demand was made for their release on bail. These men had been charged with being accessories to the death of Anna Lapisa, although 19 witnesses had seen policeman Beloit murder the girl. Ettore and Giovannitti were refused bail and held in jail for 7 months. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the leading woman organizer of the IWW, gave splendid service at Lawrence, speaking to the strikers, and also at meetings outside the strike district, raising money for the relief fund and for the defense of prisoners. We were sending the children of strikers to sympathizers in other cities to be cared for during the strike. Some of the groups of children were large and attracted a good deal of attention and sympathy, One day, when a group was to be sent away, the militia formed a cordon around the depot, and the police attempted to prevent the children getting on the train. When one of these big burlies would lay his hand on a child, of course it would scream, and its mother would fly to the rescue of her captive young. There was a turmoil in the station between the policemen and the fighting woman. They stopped the children leaving this day, but they never attempted it a second time. And there's an image of the children of strikers leaving to live with strike sympathizers during the strike. One morning on the picket line, a Syrian boy who belonged to the strikers' fife and drum corps was stabbed in the back with a bayonet. He died soon after being taken to the hospital. Not only the local police force was used against the strikers, but police from other cities, the state police, and the state militia had been called in. These organized forces used the mills as their barracks. And there's the Massachusetts state militiamen with bayonets fixed at the strikers. The women strikers were as active and efficient as the men, and fought as well. One cold morning after the strikers had been drenched on the bridge with the fire hose of the mills, the woman caught a policeman in the middle of the bridge and stripped off his uniform, pants and all. They were about to throw him in the icy river when other policemen rushed in and saved him from the chilly ducking. We appealed to Congressman Victor Berger for an investigation of the Lawrence strike, and through the Socialist congressman's efforts, a hearing was arranged before the Rules Committee of the House in Washington, D.C. When we got news of this, the General Strike Committee decided to send 16 witnesses to Washington, all boys and girls under 16 years of age. One of them was a little girl whose hair had been caught in a machine and her scalp torn from her head. These child workers from the mills were able to picture their working conditions and their home life, and we felt convinced of their ability to explain why they and 25,000 others were striking in the textile center of Lawrence and adjacent towns. Margaret Sanger, who afterward became famous for her campaigns for birth control, went with the children to Washington. On the day of their arrival there, the boys and girls appeared before the Rules Committee. Samuel Gompers was present, presumably in the interests of the AFL. He was called as a witness and condemned the strike and its leaders. Suddenly, a childish voice rang out. "You old son of a bitch, you're telling a goddamned lie." It was the Polish boy who had interrupted Gompers. The chairman of the committee rapped vigorously with his gavel and, looking sternly at the boy, said, "Young man, that sort of language will not be tolerated here. Do not attempt it again." "It's the only kind of language I know," answered the boy, "and I'm not a-going to let that guy lie about us and get away with it." This incident is not reported in Gompers' 70 years of life and labor. A newspaper reporter at the hearing remarked that here was presented the old and the new of the labor movement. When the committee in Lawrence heard that Gompers was taking part in the hearing, they decided to send me down to Washington to help the children who were representing the strikers if they should need help. But the children had told everything about conditions in the mills, even being compelled to buy drinking water.
Thank you, comrade. And with that, we'll stop for another round of discussion. Wanted to point out one kind of interesting fact, if you ever do get a chance to read the autobiography of Big Bill Haywood. Man's led quite an interesting life, and throughout much of his life as well, he was actually blind in one eye from a incident in his childhood. So if you ever wonder why he sometimes seems to be squinting in his photographs, that's why.
Sorry for raising my hand so much, but I have a general question about unions. Let's take my local area, for example. We have a bus company that I think is semi-owned by the government and semi-private. And from my understanding, they were unionized right from the get-go. So my question is, how is it determined if a union has to be fought for, or if a job starts out already unionized, if that makes sense? Thank you.
Well, I don't know the exact situation. I mean, it's a little broad, but if it's unionized right from the get-go, I'm concerned that that means it was a company union that was formed, but maybe knows more of that. I've never actually heard that situation before.
To my understanding, like for example, our bus company, a local bus company here, I have the impression, or I think they were unionized right from the get-go. So I'm wondering how it's decided if a job gets unionized right away, or if a company or the employees have to fight for a union, and like how is it decided? I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah.
By any chance, do you know what union it is?
I can check quickly and I'll get back to you.
I believe it's ATU, which is I mean, there's aspects of many locals that accompany unions. There's also, in many cases, a rich militant tradition, and at the same time within the union. So I'd have to know more specifics to give you an answer.
Thank you, Comrade. And then one thing I'd like to add to that is I know some places even there is laws that businesses have to be represented by a union, which Comrade Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Washington State, there's a law that has businesses have to be, or the workers there have to be represented by a union, or at least that's what I remember when I used to work at a Kroger affiliated supermarket out in Seattle.
Yeah, so I have it here in the context of Metro Vancouver, TransLink, our bus company, our SkyTrain subway bus company. Unifor Local 2200 represents maintenance employees, while CUPE Local 4500 represents bus supervisors, and Unifor Local 333 represents the bus drivers. So I know you won't know because this is our local bus company, but I believe that this company was unionized right from the get-go, and I'm wondering what distinguishes a company from having to fight for a union versus starting with one. Thank you.
I'm not too familiar with labor law in Canada, but I'm sure that may have something to do with it, especially it sounds like it's in the public sector. Given that the mass transit industry comes, even if it's not a public company or a public agency, it comes from public funds. So there may be there may have been some lobbying that went into that. Um, I really have to dig deeper to know for sure, but in many cases, companies will approve more favorable unions in order to avoid more militant organizing. That does happen.
Thank you, Comrade. Yeah, I was kind of struck when you said the bus supervisors have a union. And I'm thinking, your management, shut up.
Yeah, man. We have our supervisors here in New York City have unions as well. The dispatchers have their own union, and then the superintendents have their own union as well.
Okay. Wouldn't call you a real worker, but whatever. All right, we'll go over to our next section, which will be the aftermath of the strike. The results of the strike and the reading of the statement by the Lawrence workers. Comrade Joe, this is your section. You have the floor.
The strike ends in victory. On March 12th, 1912, the strike was ended after management gave in to strikers' demands for a 15% wage increase, and any overtime over 54 hours a week was paid double wages. The workers succeeded in ending the premium system, which made a significant portion of the workers' income subject to attendance and monthly production quotas. The biggest outcome of the protest, however, was that it proved despite the 28 nationalities and 45 dialects of the workers that were divided by the bosses on ethnic lines, the overwhelming majority of the 30,000 workers came together against the bosses. And this is the proclamation of striking textile workers of Lawrence. We, the 20,000 textile workers of Lawrence, are out on strike for the right to live free from slavery and starvation, free from overwork and underpay, free from a state of affairs that had become so unbearable and beyond our control that we were compelled to march out of the slave pens of Lawrence in united resistance against the wrongs and injustice of years and years of wage slavery. In our fight, we have suffered and borne patiently the abuse and calumnies of the mill owners, the city government, police, militia, state government, legislature, and the local police court judge. We feel that in justice to our fellow workers, we should at this time make known the causes which compelled us to strike against the mill owners of Lawrence. We hold that as useful members of society and as wealth producers, we have the right to lead decent and honorable lives, that we ought to have homes and not shacks, that we ought to have clean food and not adulterated food at high prices, that we ought to have clothes suited to the weather and not shoddy garments, that to secure sufficient food, clothing, and shelter in a society made up of a robber class on the one hand and a working class on the other hand, it is absolutely necessary for the toilers to band themselves together and form a union, organizing its powers in such form as to them seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that conditions long established should not be changed for light or transient causes, and accordingly, all experience has shown that the workers are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by striking against the misery to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and ill treatment, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them to a state of beggary, it is their duty to resist such tactics and provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these textile workers, and such is now the necessity which compels them to fight the mill-owning class. The history of the present mill owners is a history of repeated injuries, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these textile workers. To prove this, let facts be submitted to all right-thinking men and women of the civilized world. These mill owners have refused to meet the committees of the strikers. They have refused to consider their demands in any way that is reasonable or just. They have, in the security of their sumptuous offices, behind stout mill gates and serried rows of bayonets and policemen's clubs, defied the state, the city, and the public. In fact, the city of Lawrence and the government of Massachusetts have become the creatures of the mill owners. They have declared that they will not treat with the strikers till they return to the slavery against which they are in rebellion. They have starved the workers and driven them to such an extent that their homes are homes no longer, inasmuch as the mothers and children are driven by the low wages to work side by side with the father in the factory for a wage that spells bare existence and untimely death. To prove this to the world, the large death rate of children under 1 year of age in Lawrence proves that most of these children perish because they were starved before birth, and those who survive the starving process grow up the victims of malnutrition. The mill owners not only have the corrupting force of dollars on their side, but the powers of the city and state governments are being used by them to oppress and sweep aside all opposition on the part of those overworked and underpaid textile workers. The very courts where justice is supposed to be impartial are being used by the millionaire mill owners. And so serious has this become that the workers have lost all faith in the local presiding judge. Without any attempt at a trial, men have been fined or jailed from 6 months to a year on trumped-up charges that would be a disgrace even in Russia. This is Tsarist Russia in 1912. This judge is prejudiced and unfair in dealing with the strikers. He has placed all the strikers brought before him under excessive bail. He has dealt out lengthy sentences to the strikers as if they were hardened criminals or old-time offenders. He has refused to release on bail 2 of the leaders of the strike, while he released a prisoner charged with conspiracy and planting dynamite on $1,000 bail. He sentenced, at one morning session of court, 23 strikers to 1 year in jail on the fake charge of inciting to riot. This judge has declared he is opposed to the union that is conducting the strike. The brutality of the police in dealing with the strikers has aroused them to a state of rebellious opposition to all such methods of maintaining order. The crimes of the police during this trouble are almost beyond human imagination. They have dragged young girls from their beds at midnight. They have clubbed the strikers at every opportunity. They have dragged little children from their mothers' arms, and with their clubs they have struck women who are in a state of pregnancy. They have placed people under arrest for no reason whatsoever. They have prevented mothers from sending their children out of the city, and have laid hold of the children and the mothers violently, and thrown the children into waiting patrol wagons like so much rubbish. They have caused the death of a striker by clubbing the strikers into a state of violence. They have arrested and clubbed young boys and placed under arrest innocent girls for no offense at all. The militia has used all kinds of methods to defeat the strikers. They have bayoneted a young boy. They have beaten up the strikers. They have been ordered to shoot to kill. They have murdered one young man who died as a result of being bayoneted in the back. They have threatened one striker with death if he did not close the window of his home. They have threatened to stay in the city until the strike is over. They have bayoneted one citizen because he would not move along fast enough. And they have held up at the point of the bayonet hundreds of citizens and Civil War veterans. The city government has denied the strikers the right to parade through the streets. They have abridged public assemblage by refusing the strikers the use of the city hall and public grounds for public meetings. They have turned the public buildings of the city into so many lodging houses for an army of hirelings and butchers. They have denied the strikers the right to use the common for mass meetings, and they have ordered the police to take little children away from their parents, and they are responsible for all the violence and brutality on the part of the police. The Massachusetts legislature has refused to use any of the money of the state to help the strikers. They have voted $150,000 to maintain an army of 1,500 militiamen to be ready to shoot down innocent men, women, and children who are out on strike for a living wage. They have refused to use the powers of the state for the workers. They have appointed investigation committees who declare, after perceiving the signs of suffering on the part of the strikers on every side, that there is no trouble with these people. All the nations of the world are represented in this fight of the workers for more bread. The flaxen-haired son of the North marches side by side with his dark-haired brother of the South. They have toiled together in the factory for one boss, and now they have joined together in a great cause, and they have cast aside all racial and religious prejudice for the common good, determined to win a victory over the greed of the corrupt, unfeeling mill owners who have ruled these people so long with the whip of hunger and the lash of the unemployed. Outlawed, with their children taken away from them, denied their rights before the law, surrounded by bayonets of the militia, and driven up and down the streets of the city by an overfed and arrogant body of police, these textile workers, sons and daughters of the working class, call upon the entire civilized world to witness what they have suffered at the hands of the hirelings of the mill-owning class. These men and women cannot suffer much longer. They will be compelled to rise in armed revolt against their oppressors if the present state of affairs is allowed to continue in Lawrence.
Thank you, General Secretary Joe. We'll go to our next discussion round.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I just want to say, the landscape of America, as well as specifically talking of the Gilded Age and right before World War I, is almost a purely Hobbesian landscape. Just a purely Hobbesian landscape. You just have a bunch of violence, and the thing is state-sanctioned violence. State-sanctioned violence, killing one another just to protect someone else's capital. That's all.
Thank you.
I liked what they said. They said the city government has denied the strikers the right to parade through the streets. They were referring to First Amendment rights and things like that. And usually now people say you can't do that. You can't go on the street or go near the city hall. That's all.
Thank you, Carmack. Yeah, we had a lot of that, especially during the George Floyd incident here in Minneapolis.
Two-part question. One, what happened to the people that were in prison on trumped-up charges when the strike was ended? Were their charges dropped, or did they have to stay in prison until the end of their sentence? And the second question, how were the strikes paid, or how were people's livelihood paid for during the strike? It said they had starvation wages even when they were working. Did they have a strike fund? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, that's why my hand was up for the first part. Yeah, so the first part, a lot of striking workers were thrown in jail for, even like a day or a few days, and a lot of them weren't even recorded. They were just, without any they were just thrown in jail. But some that stayed in for the longest period of time, Giovannitti and Ettore, as well as another one named Joseph Caruso. Um, they were framed for that murder of that Italian girl, and on September 30th, 15,000 strikers or 15,000 workers went on a one-day strike again, demanding her release or their release, as well as a couple international events where French and Swedish workers boycotted and striked, to get them released. And then there were Italian protesters outside of the U.S. consulate. Finally, on November 26th of that year, they were released and acquitted. As for the second part of your question, yes, they did have a strike fund. I saw a number, it was around like 60,000 that they
90
raised.
seconds.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, they raised like $60,000. You saw, that was one of the big jobs of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was to go around to all the sympathetic people to the strike and raise funds that way.
Thank you, Governor Tyler. Another thing was there were, as it was alluded to, there were other towns that had offered like, hey, you can send your kids over, we'll feed them and take care of them. And I believe there was also people running other stuff into Lawrence. And of course, one of the incidences was the police and the militia stopped the mothers from sending their kids out one time. And though that became such a bad look for them that they didn't try doing that very often.
What justification did the police use for trying to prevent the children from being sent away?
Intimidation of their parents.
I mean, what justification for not why they did it, but what justification?
I couldn't tell you an exact charge, but there's probably a million different ones they used or said. Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
First, in response, at this time period, it wasn't uncommon for cities to deny striking workers the ability to picket, parade, or whatever you may call it, public gatherings. Just a year later in Paterson, New Jersey, here, a similar thing happened with the giant silk strike in Paterson. And workers ended up congregating in a nearby town, Halinon, New Jersey. They congregated at a place called the Botto House, which was owned by, I forget the name, their first name, the Botto family. Ironically enough, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was also highly involved in the strike. And that house today now is the American Native Museum, of which we have a relationship with them through Lowell. But I just wanted to pose a question. After listening to the horrific stories that General Secretary Joe read in that last section, I got a question for everybody here. Have you learned about any of this in school? Have you been taught about any of this? And then you listen to the way we talk about our quote-unquote adversarial countries. You would think there's something that happened there, but no, this is right here. And just be careful because a lot of these, hired gangs or private police, they still exist today. I know they weren't mentioned explicitly here, but the Pinkertons, which is one of these grooming squads that exist throughout the country, they still exist today, and they were very active here in Staten Island with the Amazon organized a campaign a couple of years ago. So, though we've had some quote unquote, for the most part, labor peace, all this stuff can happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade. Yeah, to answer your question, I think most I may have heard about it was, well, there were these anarchist people that threw bombs and caused disruptions in the later 19th century in inner cities with labor disputes. That's maybe about it.
Well, I mean, what just said, I think, is an interesting point, and I don't think this is too off topic. I'm basically reiterating what he just said, but I literally just had a conversation a couple hours ago with a fellow union member who mentioned how unions aren't as necessary now because companies aren't killing people like they used to. And I basically made the argument that it's still happening in like the third world. And, but I'm trying to reiterate what just said is there is a sort of labor peace right now. But basically what I said is like the only thing stopping it from going back to being that bad is the NLRB. And that's pretty much on the chopping block right now. I don't think that was as convincing of an argument as I wanted to make, though, which is why I'm bringing this up right now.
Thank you, Comrade. Did you want to respond to that real quick? Sorry, Comrade Jake.
Yes, I would say it is still happening. Not to the same length, not as bad. If anybody was on the Harry Bridges School of Labor this month where we had the Triangle Shirt Race Factory fire, we had examples of it happening today. And, we had a chocolate factory in Pennsylvania that collapsed. We had, of course, East Palestine. There's numerous workplace injuries at places like Amazon. Hell, even UPS, which is unionized. How many people died from heat exhaustion? UPS workers in the last 10 years. All right, so it is very much happening today, and just like learning from it in history books, well, you don't learn from it in history books for the most part. They don't really talk about it in the capitalist media either. That is the problem. And that is where a lot of the misleaders, that is one of the areas where a lot of the misleaders of labor fail to address the real conditions that the workers are facing here in the US.
Thank you, Comrade.
For better or for worse, the way that I would have responded to that opinion by a fellow worker is that when the boss does the bare minimum, right? Like when the boss pays you minimum wage, when the boss only respects union procedures in certain contexts, what the boss is telling you, the boss is not saying, "Oh, we'll give you guys more, we'll be more lenient in the future. We just need to see some expectations met." What they're really saying is what they're really saying is that we would do less if we were allowed to, right? If you're being paid a minimum wage, what the boss is telling you is, I would pay you less if the state wouldn't allow me to, if the state would allow me to. So when it comes to, those brutal fights in the street, all of that we went over this meeting, just children being brutalized. I mean, mothers, pregnant women being brutalized. Ultimately, that amount of struggle brought us up to what we are at today, objectively. And our rights, our labor rights, our civil rights are like a muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it, plain and simple. That's where my headspace is on that issue.
Thank you, Comrade.
Yeah, I think Carmen kind of summed up my points. I I feel like, we see these battles, and we don't see them as labor struggles. Like when we see the outreach or the overreach of ICE going into employees or employers, places and scaring immigrants, immigrant workers. I mean, that's a point of, violence in some sense. Even you can argue like the whole Black Lives Matter movement, on the obvious racism that happens towards the black population on police. This is all just kind of training for something like what could happen, what we just talked about today. And we kind of left on a cliffhanger there. It looked like they were going to get a little militant there. And perhaps that's why it stopped. And, it looked like they did have some gains. I mean, there were some good things like a increase of wages, but how close was it to that? And that is something that I think I would like to know is right up to that point, like, oh, this could get militant. Did anyone find any of that research or know about like how militant with violence that the strikers were?
Well, I mean, I saw that, they were getting militant. There was a point where, the police were drenching the workers in water in like freezing temperatures, and the workers overwhelmed the officer and were about to throw him into the water. But then other police backup came to stop that. But it was getting increasingly violent, and ultimately on March 12th, which tomorrow is the anniversary of, that's when the strike ended. The bosses were obviously scared. So they agreed to what's the word? I can't. What?
A sit down and negotiation.
Well, yeah, essentially that's what I'm trying to say, but the word is on the tip of my tongue. I just can't get it out. But yeah, like the only reason why they were forced into negotiating was because they felt so scared of anything further. Um, Plus, the thing that was going on, what we didn't really talk about was a lot of these workers were already unionized with AFL unions. So what the IWW did was it did what was called dual unionism. It's not something we would advocate for today, but essentially the bosses wanted to end the strike and give the power back to the AFL unions that they had more control over.
Thank you, Kermit.
So it's kind of a little bit off topic, but there is a coal mine here in West Virginia called the Lear South Mine. They had an underground coal fire and it shut down part of the mine, and they laid off basically all the workers that were there after shutting everything down for a couple months, saying that they would bring them back in after they got the fire under control. And all of the articles and things that I've read about it have a huge focus on the production and how much like revenue they're losing, and how they were very excited not to have lost any like supplies and things like that, like machinery, things like that, but really hardly any mention about the workers or like them getting completely laid off after saying that they would get their jobs back. So it's just interesting how things like that are still going on.
Thank you, Kermit.
Yeah, we have to realize our whole history is about short-term victories. A long time ago, I was listening to a MoveOn.org representative talk about her great fight as far as closing down mines. I think it was actually in New Mexico. And then they won their case after 3 years of fighting. And then the attorney came up to her afterwards and he says, well, he said, fine and dandy. He says, but we'll be back in court 3 years from now. Where are you going to be? And so she realized it was a fear, what do you call it, victory. all these victories to the bosses are temporary. They will do everything to finagle. One, remember, corporations live longer than we do. And just because you have one victory, to them, that is not the war. It's a battle. And I think that's where we fail. Even in the Lawrence mill strike, we say, okay, we won, and we figure that's the end of the game. And it just plain is not, and history has taught us that. We have to always be on the defensive if we want to continue to gain and continue to even keep the rights that we had struggled for. That's all.
Well spoken, comrade. Comrade Angelo, you have not spoken tonight. You have the floor, sir.
Okay. As long as we have capitalism, we're going to have reforms. We need reforms on the capitalism. And comrade is correct. It's only temporary. When they give it to us, they could also take it away. That has happened all the time. The question is only when we overthrow capitalism and we set up socialism, that's when all those reforms become permanent. That's what happened in the socialist countries. All those labor reforms that they had on the capitalism when they were capitalists now were embedded in the constitution of those countries. So they couldn't be taken away anymore. That's the difference. You know, Gus Hall said once, socialism is not the answer. This is Gus Hall said this. Socialism gives us the tools in order to work against capitalism. The only thing that is the answer is communism. And many people in the left forget that. Even people that belong to so-called communist groups, they forget that. So Gus was correct. Socialism gives us the tools to work in capitalism against the, for economic reforms. But socialism is really the ultimate solution. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade.
I mean, communism. I'm going to say communism. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo.
I was just going to mention this back and forth is going to go on as long as we have capitalism. Where I was reminded of another quote from Gus Hall where he says that as long as capitalism or until capitalism isn't able to give people what they need to survive, it's going to go on. But when it's not able to, the masses will flock to socialism. Or that's what they're doing when they give us little nickel and dime benefits and they want to make us happy, give us what we can, so we don't need to overthrow the system as we see it. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade. If there are no other hands, the time is 9:14 Eastern. We'll go to our wrap-up and announcements if there are no other hands. New Outlook Publishers is our sister publishing house, and for an update on that, I will turn the floor over to New York. You have the floor, sir.
Yes, please visit our partner publishing house, New Outlook Publishers. You can find a lot of great works there and help support the school. Of course, the website is newoutlookpublishers.store. And that's all. Thank you.
And we will close out tonight with The Rebel Girl by Joe Hill.
There are women of many descriptions in this queer world, as everyone knows. Some are living in beautiful mansions and are wearing the finest of clothes.